Well, what I know is that I attempted to call their attention. After the report came out, I looked at it, and, it had a physical form, but it lives online. You can search it. And I could see that telomeres weren't mentioned, mice weren't mentioned, rodents aren't mentioned. And so I tried to alert them to the fact that they had screwed up, and they blew me off. They wouldn't talk to me.
Scientists are up to something again, and this time it's more dangerous than we've ever experienced. Get ready for the shocker as Joe Rogan reveals that something was released in the United States without people knowing.
So you would expect that if we had substances that were body-wide toxins and we released them into the public, having tested them on mice and not discovering that they were dangerous, that you would see relatively young people die from heart conditions, which is where we would detect that there's a problem before we would detect it anywhere else.
The hidden information. Over the years, the knowledge of science has been quite helpful in many areas, especially in the health sector. We should give scientists their flowers for being on their toes, working tirelessly to provide solutions to the rising health challenges in the world. However, what do we do when we realize that our beloved scientists may be pushing the boundaries? This has been the question on the minds of many people, at least the ones who are no longer in the dark about the hidden moves of scientists in the United States. Thanks to an anonymous hacker and guests on the Joe Rogan podcast, light has been shed on these hidden moves, and more people have come to know how scientists may have done more harm than good with this new idea. But the concern is whether the discovery is too late or not, and I guess we'll find out in the end. Sometime in 2023, an anonymous hacker managed to gain access to some hidden scientific information that would raise a lot of questions and concerns in the United States. The hidden information, which sparked huge controversy, includes loads of emails, documents, and reports from a renowned research institute in Massachusetts. Guess what? The documents showed detailed plans made by scientists to release hundreds of thousands of genetically engineered mice to the public. Yeah, that sounds scary enough, but the most troubling part is that they planned to release the mice without any public announcement. Apparently, the plan was to make people wake up to a mice invasion, just like it happens in those horror movies. Well, maybe they didn't plan to make it that dramatic anyway. The documents revealed that the genetically engineered mice would be released to several locations in the state, but the scientists had a good reason for the project. Or, they thought they did. According to the reports released by the hacker, the aim of the scientists was to study the behavior of these mice in the real world. Since they were mostly bred in the laboratory, scientists thought that they could release them into the wild so that they could check their impacts on the environment or any potential benefits they could have. Also, the study revealed that the said mice have gone through a series of genetic alterations that would make them stronger and more fit when compared to the wild mice. They were built to have different behavioral patterns and also to be resistant to diseases. Talking of disease resistance, it looked like the specific reason the scientists made the hidden plans was to use the mice to tackle a particular disease that had been ravaging the state since the early 1990s. Lyme disease. After a thorough look at the documents, critics discovered that the mice were to be dispatched to a specific location. First, the mice were to be introduced to an island where there are no people, so that the scientists could monitor their behaviors. Then, they would be released to the island of Nantucket in their numbers. And, thinking about the specific location, it became obvious that the mice saga was an experiment to guard against Lyme disease. At the time the plans were made, there was a huge outbreak of Lyme disease in Nantucket, and the island even had the highest rate of the disease at the time. Though the disease was majorly caused by the black-leg ticks, mice were the primary carriers of the disease pathogens. However, these laboratory mice have been modified so that they are resistant to the disease pathogens. And that way, they would not be able to transmit the disease to ticks which directly infect humans. According to the document, The idea was originally inspired by a professor from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who introduced the concept to the Nantucket Board of Health. As they claimed, the professor and the board introduced the idea to about 20 residents, and they were in support of it. But 20 out of the entire population of the island is such a weird figure to work with, if you ask me. I mean, imagine unleashing tens and hundreds of thousands of mice just because 20 people think it's cool. However, critics think that the people who agreed to the plan cannot be blamed because most of them were not educated on the pros and cons of the idea. And most importantly, the disease had done so much harm that they could only embrace the next solution that was promised. According to government data, the island had the highest rate of Lyme disease in the United States between 1992 to 2001, and they ranked third between 2002 and 2006. So, you can say that the disease has been a major problem for the residents of Nantucket for decades now. In fact, a surgeon at the Nantucket Hospital claims that the number of Lyme disease cases reported by hospitals since the 1980s were way lesser than the actual number. To put a figure to that, they usually had about 300 cases of Lyme disease in a year, and that's definitely a huge number for a small county. So, you cannot completely fault those 20 people for jumping at the offer when the professor and the Board of Health claimed that it would be the end of their ordeal. In order to reduce the occurrence of Lyme disease, the scientists focused on white-footed mice, which they had specifically identified as the primary source of the disease. As one of the major hosts for ticks, the white-footed mice transmit the disease easily. They transfer the disease-causing bacteria to the ticks, which later transfers it to other mice and then to humans. So, scientists believe that they can reduce the rate of Lyme disease if they can stop the flow of disease pathogens between the mice and the ticks. And this would happen with the use of the genetically modified mice, which are built to be disease-resistant. However, for the idea to work, they have to identify the genes that are responsible for disease resistance in the whitefoot mice. These genes will then be multiplied so that the population of mice would have an increased resistance for infections, specifically Lyme's disease in this case. The scientists seem to have a strong belief in this idea, and they decided to come up with over 100,000 of such genetically modified mice. According to the hidden documents, the mice would be released in batches of 20,000 to 40,000 over the space of a year. So, every 2.5 months, new batches of these mice would be released into the environment. And, if nothing seems to go wrong in Nantucket, the genetically modified mice would be introduced to larger areas across the Northeast region. So, in their heads, you can say that the scientists pictured the mice invasion as a blessing to biomedical research and maybe some parts of agriculture too. However, after the information came into the light, the public did not seem to see it the same way. I mean, if the idea was that great, why should it be kept as a secret from the people they were probably trying to help? And what if the potential benefits they pictured turned out to be lesser than the risks involved? Come to think of it, since the whole thing was a test that they have never tried before, they can only guess or speculate about the result. For all we know, it could turn out to be good or bad. But the scientists made their plans without thinking too much about the probability that the idea could go south. Anyway, they went ahead with their laboratory processes, and they were able to edit the genes of the large population of mice using a technique called clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. And the plan would represent the first introduction of genetically engineered mice that were built based on this method. But it could also be the beginning of great troubles. What could go wrong? According to a guest on the Joe Rogan podcast, the scientists may have found out along the line that their mice would do more harm than good. But instead of them going back to the drawing board and having a rethink on the idea, they chose to sweep the observation under the carpet as they claimed to take care of the situation.
It's been taken care of is a very strange way to describe something that could be an enormous problem.
Now, this episode of Joe's podcast has the public questioning the real motive of these scientists or what could possibly go wrong. Firstly, the document revealed that it may take up to a year or more before the impact of these genetically modified mice would be seen. This means that there would be no significant change in the rate of Lyme disease or the tick population until after a year or more. So, when you think about it, it's all just a guessing game and the scientists are only trying to put on a show like they are smart and they have it all figured out. So, this would also mean that the people may have to live with such an enormous population of mice without any significant result. I mean, how did they see the need to saturate a state with mice for a year when the same time can go into looking for better cures to the disease? No wonder they decided to hide the plan from the people. However, when the cat was let out of the bag and the information became public, the scientists claimed that they would test the mice in unpopulated locations first before they are introduced to the islands and states. Well, that sounds fair, but how else would they have calmed the raging public? They definitely knew what the public didn't, and sincerely, it may get a lot worse. All right, this is what we're talking about. Instead of reducing the rate of disease, the genetic modification in the whitefoot mice may pose major health risks in the state, and this has been proven by biologists. However, things remain fishy as the scientists in charge of this mice invasion project seem to be doing their best to hide the whole truth from the public. According to the guest on this episode of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, biologists have observed that the mice were bad models, and they may produce results that are far from what the scientists pictured. Bad ones at that. But, to his greatest shock, scientists have been playing some dirty games with journalists so that the real truth about these mice will not become publicly known.
Even more curious is the argument, well, everybody knows that the mice are bad models, which is insane because this telomere
You actually
problem,
got that response?
Yeah.
From?
Several people. I went to several different journalists, and it wasn't that I was told who they contacted. What I was told was that they contacted somebody, and this is what they heard. And so their enthusiasm evaporated at the point they make a phone call.
So, what could be the real truth? And why are the scientists trying to hide it? Well, the modifications made to the genes of these mice have made them carriers of worse diseases. In fact, the altered pathogens which they carry would be the beginning of new diseases in both wildlife and humans. No doubt, they may be able to eradicate Lyme disease, but it gets worse because these modified mice would cause the outbreak of a new disease. And, since there are so many of them, the disease spreads faster, and it may now be hard to curtail it. You can say that the scientists will never be able to deal with the monsters they made, and the entire ecosystem will have to suffer for it. Speaking of the ecosystem, the mice population would not only spread disease, they will also greatly impact the way our environment functions naturally. For example, since the mice are modified to perform better than those in the wild mice population is definitely at a disadvantage. As the genetically modified mice reproduce faster, they are able to raise their population exponentially in a short period of time. However, this would be bad news for the wild mice because it would bring about an imbalance in the rate of competition between the species. And, of course, we know which species wins in the end, right? This means that our entire ecosystem will be saturated with genetically engineered mice. And, looking at how fast they can spread new diseases, that doesn't sound good. But that's not even the height of it all. Aside from the great impact that they have on the wild mice, these genetically modified mice will disrupt the existing food chains in our ecosystem. Since they are biological modified, they have enhanced abilities, and this include extraordinary hunting potentials. So, overhunting may set in, and before we know it, these modified mice will run down the entire population of their prey in no time. Now, that should have us worried because when their prey is no longer extant, there may be another great effect in the ecosystem. For example, the mice may now invade homes and public places in search of their food, and the increased mice-human interaction could be very dangerous. Yes, as you probably already know, that would also increase the rate of disease transmission in the population of humans. Also, the control of diseases and pathogens might have worked well in the laboratory, but it does not mean that the same result will be achieved when the mice are released to the environment. From an episode of Joe Rogan's episode, his guest stated that all the mice used in these experiments were from the same source and they were subjected to the same treatments. So, that makes it possible that all the mice would respond to treatments the same way. However, the story may change when they are exposed to different conditions in the wild.
That there was a laboratory in Bar Harbor, Maine called the Jack's Lab that was the source for all of the mice being used in all of the laboratories in the country.
The mice may have proven to be resistant to disease pathogens in the laboratory, but in the wild, the disease-causing parasites may respond differently to their resistance. Firstly, if the parasites are not able to infect the genetically modified species, they can shift their focus to other species, and this may lead to the outbreak of new diseases. Also, the ability of these modified mice to resist diseases could end up mounting selective pressure on pathogens. Okay, let's make that make sense. When the disease-causing parasites are no longer able to affect the mice, they double up and come back stronger. So, with the evolution of what the biologists called the virulent strains, the guys in charge of the project may have to go back to the laboratory. I mean, these virulent strains are so powerful that they can affect both the genetically modified mice and the non-modified ones. So, if that happens, there may be an outbreak of diseases that are strong enough to decimate both the wildlife and the human population. Now, what's worse than unlocking a new level of disease that may even be incurable? Maybe the idea of eradicating a particular disease with genetically engineered mice. Or, this could be the worst part, biologists have also been able to identify the most significant risks that may come with the release of these genetically modified mice into our environment. Since animals will not be able to identify the ones that have been modified in the lab, there are chances that the wild mice may interbreed with the genetically modified ones, and this may cause a mix-up of genes in the resulting mice population. If genetically modified animals mate with the wild ones, their modified genes will definitely be introduced into the gene pool of the natural population of mice. This would then cause genetic contamination, which can result in some kind of effects that the scientists may not be able to predict beforehand. These unpredictable effects will include the emergence of hybrid species of mice that will display unknown behaviors and ecological roles. So, apart from the outbreak of new diseases and the major changes that may occur in the ecosystem, the experiment may lead to some confusion in the future, and the original genes of natural mice may be completely lost. That should be scary, though. I mean, what if these hybrid mice grow to become like those fictional mutant creatures? Not trying to scare you, but come to think of it, the hybrid species could turn out to be anything we can or cannot imagine. In fact, they can start growing faster and bigger than the natural mice do right now, and before you know it, the whole environment becomes a mess of some unknown mice. All because some scientists were trying to eradicate a particular disease. All that said, the release of these hidden documents and the real truth about the consequences have become a scary topic today. As expected, it has raised several questions about the intentions of the scientists. On an episode of Joe Rogan, such questions were raised, and he began to wonder if the scientists actually know the consequences of this hidden plan.
Were they not aware of the consequences of this problem with these mice?
So, again, we have a serious problem. It's not about mice. It's not about virology, right? It's a general systemic failure of reason.
Well, the The scientists may not have full knowledge of the likely results their plans would have. But one thing is sure. They are aware of some of these repercussions, and they probably just chose to ignore them. I mean, isn't that why they chose to make the whole plan hidden in the first place? They clearly know that the introduction of these mice into the wild may lead to some unintended consequences, but they would rather focus on the short-term effect than the long-term result. Though this long-term results can greatly jeopardize the ecosystem and cause some unforeseen ecological impacts, the scientists and Board of Health hid such a huge plan from the public, and their silence has been the most shocking part of the whole thing. Trust me, the plan itself is not as troubling as the lack of transparency and public awareness. The decision of these scientists to conduct the experiment and unleash hundreds of mice on the public without informing them or obtaining necessary regulatory approvals has birthed serious controversies. In fact, in the world of science, such an act is considered as a major breach of ethical standards. Normally, for every scientific research, especially those involving genetic modification and introduction of new species to the public, transparency and public approval are as important as the result of the experiment itself. The public has every right to know about this kind of activity that will definitely leave major impacts on the environment and even on their health. Also, when planning such experiments, scientists have a responsibility to make sure that the results they would get from the genetic modifications is far greater than the potential risk it would pose on wildlife and ecosystems. But in this case, the repercussions seem to outweigh the eradication of Lyme disease, which can be achieved through other safer means. Scientists should know that the use of vaccines is still very much effective and would be better than the genetic engineering thingy, but for reasons best known to them, they chose to try out an idea that they do not even know how it may end. Don't get it twisted, guys. The knowledge of genetic modification technology has really caused a shift in biological sciences, and it has done a lot of good. Talk of several opportunities for advancement in our environment, in medicine, and even agriculture. However, there are several risks that may be attached to it sometimes. And this is why public preparation and ethical considerations are needed when experiments involve a large population of humans and wildlife. Unfortunately, the scientists in charge of this project made plans to release the genetically modified mice between 2020 and 2023. Though the documents claim that the experiment will first be carried out in an uninhabited location to monitor the mice and ensure safety, no one knows if that was really done. And, though there was no proof that the plan had been carried out at the time the documents were found in 2023, we may still have to sleep with one eye closed. All right, we have come to the end of this thought-provoking topic. Hope you enjoyed the video. What do you think about this hidden secret? Do you think that the whole experiment may end without any negative consequences? Let us know your thoughts about this topic in the comments section. And if you have any questions, you can ask in the comments as well.